It seems to me at the time, and it seems looking back 5 years later, that certain dominoes fell in a certain order, almost as though it was planned that way to get particular people on board with the agenda. There was a rather dynamic debate going on in the live stream chat of the Late Night Truth Lounge last night, the 311 Grand Spectacular 5-year anniversary special, which is available to download or stream right now. I'll link to that in the show notes below. But the point is, I was taking a look back at some of the footage and the news stories and what was going on 5 years ago to the day. I was doing that yesterday, and in the live stream chat, Psy Girl was saying this: the professional athletes going along with the COVID scare was essential. The strongest must be shown to be weak, so that everyone will be eager for the you-know-what. But the NBA and NHL participation was absolutely critical to propagating the panic. Now that's just one screenshot from the live chat. Her basic point was that this is what got the men on board. Shutting down their sports at that time helped to convince them that this was a real thing that people should be scared about, concerned about, and they should go along with the agenda. Now, I happen to agree with Psy Girl on this, but a number of people in the live stream chat disagreed, and I'm not sure if that's because they don't remember what happened, because it was very clear what was happening at the time. The reason we got onto that was because one of the questions for the JLB trivia in last night's episode had to do with this guy, Mickey Osterholm, who appeared on the Joe Rogan show just one day before all of the lockdowns began. As you can see there, March 10, 2020. And right at the beginning, in the first minutes of his appearance, again, this is March 10 of 2020, this is the kind of thing that he was saying.
Just remember, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about almost no cases in the United States. And now that we're testing for it and watching the spread as it's unfolding, those numbers are going up astronomically. 3 weeks ago, Italy was just living life just fine. Now they're literally in a virtual shutdown in the northern parts of Italy. And that's the challenge with an infectious disease like this. It can spread very quickly, and it also can affect people. I think
it's easy to forget this now, but at that time, this is the day before March 11, 2020, at that time, the idea of the United States or Australia or England shutting down, having a lockdown, that was crazy. That was a wild idea, especially in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. But also in places like England, the home of the Magna Carta and the birthplace of human rights as we know it today. So how could they suddenly get so many people to go along with the idea that this was a serious issue that was worthy of businesses shutting down, people staying home, life as we know it changing rapidly, dramatically overnight? How did they do that?
Maybe to put this into modern terms, because this is something we think of often when we think of pre-antibiotic days, the old-time medicine. We have an employee at our Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, and she has a dear friend who lives in Milan, Italy, and she works at a hospital there. And she texted this to this employee of ours last night. And this was an email that came out yesterday from one of their physicians in Milan at the largest hospital there. And he said, I just got a very disturbing message from a cardiologist at one of the Milan's largest hospitals. They're deciding who they have to let die. They aren't screening this.
They're deciding who they have to let die. In Italy, which as he just said, according to the narrative, 3 weeks ago they were just living their lives the way that we are. 3 weeks ago they were doing that. Now they're having to decide who they let die.
Staff anymore because they need all hands on deck, and they have very small areas of the hospital dedicated to non-COVID patients where they still screen doctors. Everybody else is dedicated to COVID patients, so even if they're positive, meaning that they're sick, but they don't have a severe cough or fever, then they have to work.
They're short-staffed. It's all hands on deck because this is a huge problem in Italy. 3 weeks ago, they were just eating their pasta and kicking around their soccer balls and wearing their Versace designer clothes. But now it's all hands on deck. It's death. It's mayhem. They're having to choose who lives and who dies. And this is what Mickey Osterholm was saying to Joe Rogan on March 10, 2020. And the importance of the Joe Rogan element in all of this will become clear later when I show you some other statistics, which some people will say are sexist or misogynist or whatever. I don't care, folks. The facts are the facts. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So that was on March 10 was Mickey Osterholm. This was March 11 of 2020.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization, this guy here, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, or whatever his name is, says, "We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic." So, March 10, this guy is saying, it can happen suddenly. March 11, this guy says, "We have therefore made the assessment." Now, what happened on March 12? NHL suspending play immediately due to coronas. The NHL has suspended its season because of the rapid spread of the coronavirus, but hopes to resume play in the future. In a statement issued Thursday, the NHL said that it is no longer appropriate to try to continue to play games at this time. Okay, that was the NHL. How about the Formula One, which I understand for Americans, Formula One isn't considered a very important sport from what I've heard, but in Europe, Formula One is huge, as big as NASCAR, if not bigger. Well, their season was beginning in Melbourne, and here's what happened as reported on March 13. Remember the timeline here. Formula One's Australian Grand Prix cancelled amid coronavirus fears. Decision made hours before first practice session. So a statement from the FIA said, following the confirmation that a member of the McLaren racing team has tested positive and the team's decision to withdraw from the Grand Prix, the FIA and Formula One convened a meeting of the other 19 principals on Thursday evening. Well, March 11th was a Wednesday, so Thursday was the 12th. So again, remember the timeline here. And at this point, I'm not trying to say that this guy's in on it or Rogan's in on it. I'm not saying anyone's in on some plan. I'm just saying let's look at the way the dominoes fell. Mickey Osterholm goes on Joe Rogan on the 10th and says, 3 weeks ago, Italians were just living their lives, and now they have to choose who will live and who will die. The next day, Dr. Tedros says, "We have therefore made the assessment." Then the next day, the NHL suspends its season. Formula One suspends its season. The NBA actually ended theirs on March 11. This is from News 9. March 11, 2020 is a day that will forever be remembered as the eyes of the sports world were focused on Oklahoma City. The scheduled game between Utah and Oklahoma City was postponed that night 5 years ago, shortly before the NBA suspended its regular season. Now, some of you might remember all of this, but I'm willing to bet that a lot of people don't remember just how rapidly this happened, how quickly the dominoes fell. The Premier League is huge in England and indeed around the world. The Premier League suspended as coronavirus continues to trouble football. The Premier League season has been suspended until April 3 at the earliest due to the widespread coronavirus outbreak. This is dated March 13. So again, we've got March 10, March 11, and then between 11, 12, and 13, all the major leagues also shut down. Of course, it was reported on March 12 that Tom Hanks had been the first celebrity to be reported coronavirus positive. Yes, that was reported on March 12. Let's find the date here, March 12. It's ambiguous whether the diagnosis was March 11 or March 12, but it was around the same time as all of this. March 10, Mickey Osterholm and Joe Rogan. March 11, Dr. Tedros. And then March 11, 12, 13, all the sports, and of course, Tom Hanks. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, what Side Girl was suggesting in the live stream chat last night, and I was suggesting the same thing while I was live streaming, is that this was important in convincing the men, the young men, that this was a real thing. That if they were told to stay home, stay safe, they should do so. Now, why was it important to convince the men? Well, first of all, here's a passage from the first chapter of 1984. Literally, this is like page 6 or 7. It says, in fact, what page is this? Page 7, yeah. It says, "It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and noses out of unorthodoxy." And I'm just using 1984 by Orwell as a way to preface what I'm going to say, which is that any of you who have eyes to see and ears to hear and brains inside your heads know full well that generally speaking, it is the women who go along with the consensus. They go along with the authority. They do what they're told by Big Daddy government. They love it. Not all of them, of course, and not only women, many men, many, especially the feminine men, the weak men, the girly boys, the fatsos, the guys who couldn't do a single pull-up if you paid them. They also go along with the orthodoxy, yes. But generally speaking, it is the women. And you can make arguments about whether this is due to psychological evolutionary pressures, biological evolutionary pressures, socialization from a young age. You can make whatever case you want, but anybody with a brain knows it's true. So they were going to go along with this nonsense regardless. But the men had to be convinced. Now, who listens to Joe Rogan? According to this YouGov study, Joe Rogan's listeners are primarily males between the ages of 18 and 35. Now, bear that in mind when we go back through the timeline here. March 10, Osterholm goes on Joe Rogan, which is reported to be at that time the most popular podcast in the English-speaking world. Mickey Osterholm says, Joe, you have to understand, 3 weeks ago, the Italians, they were just living their lives, and now they have to choose who will live and who will die. The very next day, Dr. Tedros says, we have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic. And then over the following days, literally within hours, all of the sports that are predominantly watched by young men, they're shut down. And then, of course, Tom Hanks comes out and says that he too has caught the coronavirus. Now, I'm not suggesting that there was any grand plot where somebody got Mickey Osterholm and Joe Rogan and the heads of the NBA, NHL, Formula One in a room together and said, here's what we're going to do. I'm not suggesting that. I don't think that's what happened. But I do think there was an overt agenda behind all of this and people were taking their orders. I don't think they were in on it. I don't think they knew what they were doing. They were all just playing their role. They were cogs in a machine, a much bigger machine. And that machine was hell-bent on this so-called Great Reset 2020, and getting the men involved, getting the men on board was as simple as having someone like this Mickey Osterholm go on Joe Rogan, plant the seeds in the people's minds that this was a serious thing, had to be taken very seriously, all booga booga, the day before this thing was officially declared a so-called pandemic, at which point all the major sports went into shutdown. That's what made all of this real. Now, you can agree with me, you can disagree with me, that's up to you. I'd appreciate that you leave your comments in the comment section below. A 311 Grand Spectacular episode of the Late Night Truth Lounge is now available to download or stream. I'll put a link to that in the show notes below. Of course, it's uploaded to Spotify and to Podbean and all the places where you like to get your podcasts. I think this episode is one of the best that we've done of all time. There's some 311 trivia. There is some Corona trivia in there. Let's see how good your memory is about what happened 5 years ago. Because what sparked this conversation in the live stream chat, where Cy Girl, who I agree with, and a couple of others were of the opinion that the dominoes fell the way they did for a reason. What sparked all of that was one of the questions that I asked during the trivia. So there's a good chance you're watching this thinking that you have it all figured out and you remember exactly what happened. Let's find out. Because the trivia, I brought along the documents and I came to say, okay, how much do you remember about what happened 5 years ago? So I want to say a shout out to Cy Girl because I'm with you, and also Bob Sapp I think was in the live chat. There was a few of you who seemed to have figured out what's going on. To those of you in the live stream chat who are arguing against this idea, that's cool. Hopefully you leave a comment in the comment section below. Now that I've laid this out for you in this video, showing you the timeline, what happened on one day, the next day, and the next day, the way the dominoes fell, do you still think this was all just a so-called coincidence? And like I said, go and check out the latest episode of the Late Night Truth Lounge, the 311 special, looking at what took place 5 years ago and everything since then. Goodness gracious me. And have yourselves a lovely day and leave those comments in the comment section below. Oh, Joe, you have to understand, man. Yeah, 3 weeks ago, Italians were eating their pasta and kicking their soccer balls and arguing with their hands, and they were very passionate the way they like to be. And now they're having to choose who will live and who will die. Ooh, booga 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 booga. Cheer, man.